Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today, I want to discuss a topic that is absolutely fundamental to my worldview as a Gnostic atheist. When I talk with theists, they often whine about how atheists have a burden of proof. To which I say, of course we do. The only position that requires no evidence is that of the agnostic. To say that a God exists takes on a burden of proof, and so does saying that a God does not exist. To that end, I would like to present what I call the argument of ice. Before I begin, there are two concepts from statistics that I will be using as a common thread connecting some of the ideas that come up in the argument. If you are already familiar with microstates and macrostates, feel free to skip this bit of the video. For everyone else, I'll try to be brief, so if you want to know more about these, I recommend looking up other resources on them. Microstates are the many possible specific ways that some system could be arranged. Imagine a coin which can land on either heads or tails. Microstates refer to the specific particular way the coin lands, so heads and tails would be the two possible microstates. If there were two coins, there would be four possible microstates: heads heads, heads tails, tails heads, and tails tails. With three coins, the number increases exponentially to 8. Four coins would have 16 microstates, five would have 32, and so on. It is clear to see that in the vast majority of real systems, made of trillions of particles, there would be an exceedingly high number of microstates indeed. However, even though all real systems must exist in some microstate, it is impossible to measure which one from a practical standpoint. Even if one had precise enough equipment to measure every particle in a space, the particle interactions required to make those measurements would inevitably change the system. This is where macrostates come in. Macrostates define the macroscopic properties of objects. So, for example, the average kinetic energy of atoms defines the temperature of an object, or the average orientation of the individual atomic dipoles gives the strength and direction of a magnet. In the coin example, the macrostates could be the total number of heads. There would be two macrostates for a single coin, either one head or none. For two coins, there would be three macrostates, either two heads, one, or none. For three coins, there would be four macrostates. It is clear to see that the number of macrostates grows linearly, far slower than the exponential growth of the microstates. Note that these macrostates can just as easily be described by the total number of tails, because macrostates are but a summary of the underlying microstate, and there can be different macroscopic descriptors which are equivalent or overlapping. Now consider how many microstates correspond to each macrostate. In the case of one coin, both macrostates correspond with one microstate. For two coins, there is one way to get either 0 or 2 heads, but two ways to flip one head. For three coins, there is one way to get either 0 or 3 heads, and three ways each to get 1 or 2. The pattern continues with more and more microstates corresponding to the average macrostate, and relatively few towards the extremes. Notice that the most extreme macrostates, all heads or no heads, always have exactly one microstate, while the number of microstates always grows at least linearly with the number of coins for all other macrostates. With these fundamentals now in place, and without further ado, let me now present the argument of ICE. ICE is an acronym, and in essence, the argument I'm about to give is about why I believe the nature of God to be contradictory to the nature of reality, namely in regards to the three concepts from which I derive the acronym. The I of ICE stands for information. I use this word in the technical sense, so let me explain what it means. Imagine a system of 2 bits. As discussed earlier, this system would have 4 microstates. Information is based on the ability to differentiate these microstates from each other. In other words, it needs to be readable. For example, a computer could be told to perform one of 4 operations depending on which binary string 000110 or 11 it receives. Or a spy could make up 4 symbols to surreptitiously mark a bench for another agent to read, with each symbol representing some pre-agreed upon message. This can be extended and more information included if either more symbols are available to write, or if more symbols are written in conjunction with each other. English, for example, has 26 unique symbols, each equivalent to about 4 bits of information, or a binary string 4 symbols long. Whole words can carry dozens of bits, allowing for words with thousands of different meanings. If we look at the technical definition, the information is equal to the number of symbols included in the string times the logarithm of the number of symbols available to choose from. It is clear that information grows with both more symbols and longer strings. For example, take the sentence, "I like donuts." Information is conveyed by the fact that the sentence isn't one of the other many possible variations it could have been, like, "I like pizza," or "We like donuts," or "I eat donuts." Each variation changes the meaning in a new way. In short, the information carried is dependent on what situation is specified out of how many possible situations could be specified. If we allowed more words in the sentence, like, "I like chocolate donuts," more information would be carried as each new detail is specified. We find information all around us, and it isn't even limited to humans. A bird may look at how high the sun gets in the sky to determine when to fly south. A honeybee may look at the patterns on a flower to determine which ones have good pollen. A ribosome may have threads of DNA run through it to determine what pattern of amino acids to link together. As long as there is variation in the states that could be present, and there is consistent meaning that can be assigned to any particular state, then information can be conveyed. The C of I stands for consciousness. We all know what consciousness is. We experience it on a first-hand basis every day. Consciousness is the perception our self has of reality. It is the summation of our thoughts and feelings. It is, to put it lightly, difficult to put into words. Yet we are all more intimately familiar with it than perhaps anything else. I do not claim in this argument to come anywhere close to solving the hard problem of consciousness. I cannot explain in detail how consciousness emerges from more fundamental things. The important thing for me is the inextricable link between consciousness and information. As I read this script, I see in some parts of my visual field white and in others black. And I can interpret the particular microstate that these particular lines and curves make as English letters that I can read. With 1,000 other examples besides, all of my senses together contribute information to my consciousness. A more steady set of information is derived from my memories and sense of self. Tying these together and culminating in my conscious experience are my thoughts, which are also composed of information. At every level, the mere fact that my experience is of one particular reality and not any of a multitude of other possible realities is tied directly to the definition of information we established earlier. It is surprisingly clear to see the connection consciousness has to information if you consider thermodynamics. At a fundamental level, information requires energy to compute and manipulate. This is why computers require electrical energy to run their calculations. In much the same way, your brain requires chemical energy to be conscious. Despite making up only 2% of your body mass, it uses up 20% of your body's calories. Evolution would not allow for so much energy to go to waste, so the fact that such energy is necessary for the brain to produce consciousness goes to show just how much information is being processed in that organ. And speaking of thermodynamics, the E of ice stands for entropy. The entropy of a system is defined by the logarithm of the number of microstates corresponding to the macrostate the system is in. It is the topic of the second law of thermodynamics, which quite simply states that entropy cannot decrease over time in a closed system. In other words, a system is more likely to spread out and become disordered over time than it is for patterns or order to form from a less ordered state. Simple in concept, but complex in application. Luckily, my argument does not rely on any of the complexities of this law, merely a reframing. Entropy cannot increase going back in time. There must always be at least one microstate, so the entropy of a system definitionally cannot be negative. Thus, there must be some entropic plateau moving backwards in time, marking some minimal entropy characteristic of whatever initial state the universe was in. The second law does not explicitly conclude whether this plateau occurs at zero entropy or some small positive value. But if it is in a non-zero entropy state, then one might ask why this particular one, and not an indistinguishable one. I would propose that the zero entropy state breaks this symmetry. Any other macrostate begs the question of which microstate, which cannot be answered without reference to something more fundamental. The only macrostate which does not need to answer this unanswerable question is the one of zero entropy, which by definition corresponds with a single microstate. Another way I look at this is that entropy is capable, in a sense, of containing information. Very basically, more information requires higher entropy, corresponding to the more microstates that need to be differentiated between. As time goes on and entropy increases, it contains within it a record of how it increased. History passes and unwittingly gets written into the cosmos, mostly in the form of all the photons streaming off of particles and being lost to space. But the fundamental thing had no history, no coded record of information to be contained. The only macrostate that contains no information and has no history is the one which has no entropy. Thus, the fundamental thing had zero entropy. I will concede that this is probably the weakest part of my argument. I have no experimental evidence that the universe began at zero entropy, and I do worry that this is just some ad hoc reason I've invented to explain why the universe exists at all. But as a symmetry breaker, it doesn't seem arbitrary to me. There is a fundamental link between what time and entropy are, and so what other concept could be used to explain the beginning of time? It certainly makes more sense to me than using divinity as a symmetry breaker. I can give an analogy if that helps. Consider a deck of cards which you have just pulled out of the box. If you thumb through it and you see that it is out of order, you might reasonably think, somebody's used this before. But if you see it's lined up numerically and sorted by suit, you would more likely think, this is a brand new deck. Like the real universe, seeing a deck of cards in the ordered, low entropy state is evidence that you're looking at something hot off the press, so to speak. And I realize that theists may respond to this by pointing out that the presses making the cards were designed by humans. While I concede that this is true, the reason why the decks come out in the order they do is far more fundamental than human intent. The humans designing the machine were free to choose to print the deck in any order, were they not? Wasn't that order chosen because of its inherent simplicity, something far outside the control of human intent? Why this state was chosen rather than that is because this state is the only this which has no that. To put it all together then, one of the many properties of conscious, and especially of sentient beings, is the ability to process vast quantities of information. That is, to experience one event rather than another, the mind must be capable of distinguishing between those events. In order to process the information required to experience consciousness, the conscious system cannot be of zero entropy, and therefore cannot be the fundamental thing. Let me repeat that. The fundamental thing cannot be conscious. I do not deny that at some level something fundamental must exist, in either a self-existent or eternal regress sort of way. But by the argument of ice, I deny that that thing could be conscious. To put it more intuitively, a creator God cannot exist because consciousness is too improbable not to require an explanation, and thus cannot be a property of the most fundamental level of reality. I say this is intuitive for me because the assumption that consciousness needs to be explained seems like a major source of existential questions in the first place. How can some people wonder where they come from, wonder how the miracle of their own sentience came to be, and then answer it with, oh, God did it, and he just is? If you can accept that, why not accept that you just are? This reminds me of a story about a question that every 4-year-old asks. When I visited my home recently, my family attended church on Sunday while I stayed home. When they came back, I was talking with my dad, and he told me about a child he was talking to after the service. He was telling her about how God made her and everyone in the room, how God made everything she saw. And of course she asked, with the perfect clarity of an innocent 4-year-old, well, if God made me, then who made God? Of course my dad had an answer for her, but one which I never found convincing when I was a child. He just is, he would say. Something about his divine nature that was impossible for us to grasp. But then, if beings can just be, why bother explaining how God created me? At the end of the day, these questions can't make any conclusion in themselves. Maybe you're just a dumb 4-year-old who doesn't understand things now, but will later. But for now, you should trust your parents. But the question should leave doubt in your mind. There is never anything wrong with doubt, and as you grow, that doubt should only diminish if you find satisfying evidence. It should never diminish out of faith. Truthfully, the argument of ice is a steelman of this 4-year-old's question. The first steelman comes from recognizing how absolutely central the existential question is, and how the need to answer it implicitly stems from the improbability of my own consciousness. The claim that my mind, any human mind, even any mind at all, exists is ludicrous. What, some meat bag of chemicals and electricity is conscious? Bold claim. And yet, by the fact that my mind must exist to pose the question, the claim must be true. It is directly supported by the brute fact, I experience reality. Or as it was more famously put, I think, therefore I am. Surely then, if this ludicrous thing exists, there must be some explanation for its existence. The explanations can be boiled down to two categories. Either there is no conscious entity at the beginning, and then some chain of events eventually led to our existence, or there was a conscious entity at the beginning, and it played a key role in creating our universe. The second option looks so tempting to so many people, in part because it explains in so much simpler a way how we all came to be. We were designed. In comparison, the natural explanation seems so circuitous and unguided that it feels like a fluke that we are here at all. But the fatal flaw I see in option 2 is that it never truly explains where consciousness comes from. The whole reason I ask where I come from is because I implicitly recognize that the fact of my own existence is incredibly unlikely. But how much more complex does a God mind need to be than my own? How much more unlikely would its existence be than mine? This argument does not yet conclude that God cannot exist, merely that if one is going to accept God as an explanation, they must see evidence of it that at least equals the evidence they have for the existence of their own consciousness. No sufficient evidence has been presented, and so one should not believe in God. Indeed, when I left my faith and became an agnostic atheist, this is more or less the reason why. It wasn't until I added the final layer of the Steelman that I began to call myself a Gnostic atheist. To truly say that God could not exist, I had to find something contradictory in its nature. That something turned out to be the relation between consciousness and entropy laid out in the three concepts of the argument of ice, along with the symmetry breaker that the fundamental thing should be of zero entropy. Consciousness cannot be of zero entropy, and therefore cannot be the fundamental thing. It is no longer an argument from incredulity, in which I simply cannot imagine an explanation for God's existence. It is an argument from knowledge, in which a contradiction is found in the attempted answer. I hope that by walking you through the path I have taken the last 2 decades, I can make this argument more intuitive to understand. Never let go of that most important existential question: how did I get here? When you recognize that answering this question requires the implicit recognition that your existence is improbable, and you find the more explicit reason for that improbability in the extraordinary complexity of your very consciousness, it seems quite straightforward to me that an explanation of where consciousness comes from cannot rely on God as the fundamental source. There is one more form I can put this argument in. You have heard the technical form and the intuitive form, but any good philosopher knows that the logical syllogistic form is the only one that means anything. So then, premise 1. Something fundamental must exist. As theists themselves often say, nothing could come from nothing. I agree, if there was truly nothing fundamental which existed or which could exist, then we would never come to be. We do exist, and thus there must have been something fundamental. Notice that this premise makes no claim as to the nature of the fundamental thing. It could be a first cause or an eternal regress, a god or a multiverse or an initial state of the universe. Premise 2. If the fundamental thing is a conscious being, then it is God. This premise is mostly definitional, as the argument has to pick some particular conception of God to deal with. That said, I think it's a fair quality to pick, as it is a prime aspect of the majority of conceptions of the divine. Further, God being our creator and intending us to have some purpose is foundational to deriving any sort of moral commands from supposedly divine sources. Defining God as the source of intent behind our creation seems like fair game to me. Premise 3. For something to be fundamental, it must be of zero entropy. This premise is certainly the most speculative of the four. Nevertheless, for something to be fundamental, it must have some quality that breaks the symmetry, something which separates it from those things which aren't fundamental. And this is the symmetry breaker I propose. Given the connection time and entropy have in the second law, what else could be more intimately linked to the beginning of time than the minimal possible entropy? Premise 4. Consciousness must contain information and therefore be of non-zero entropy. This premise is what the argument of ice boils down to when you strip out all the technical bits. It is the heart of the contradiction I see in God's nature. And of course the conclusion: the fundamental thing is not God. Before I end, I want to be clear about how far I think this conclusion extends. At its core, the argument of ice rules out consciousness at the foundational level. This rules out more than just conceptions of God, though it does not rule out every conception of God. To the first point, in addition to ruling out various God concepts like Yahweh, Brahma, Gaia, Odin, it rules out philosophical concepts like last Thursdayism, which posits that everything, including our minds, popped into existence last Thursday. It rules out satires of God like universe farting fairies. It even rules out pure solipsism, the belief that one's own mind is the only thing in existence. And to the second point, it does not rule out conceptions of God which are not conscious, like in variations of Hinduism and Buddhism. It does not rule out non-conscious fundamental principles like in Taoism. It does not rule out that we live in a simulation, so long as the simulators have a universe of their own. And it does not rule out materialism, the idea that the physical universe is itself fundamental. I've put it in 3 different forms now, but at the end of the day, I have one argument supporting my worldview for why I find it reasonable to believe that there is no God. I'm putting it out to the world in the hope that, if it is right, I convince others to turn away from religious dogma. And if it is wrong, someone convinces me of my error and turns me towards truth. If you've watched this video and think I have it wrong, that I don't understand consciousness or thermodynamics or whatever, please correct me. I look forward to hearing your responses, and as always, go read a fucking book.